Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
It's very, very nice to be in Southern California in January. When you live where I live, and actually where I'm from. So I'm actually going to share a little bit about how I made the pilgrimage from, well, I don't know if I call it that, but how I made the transfer from New Orleans to South Bend. But just to give you an idea, I'm from New Orleans, as Matt said. That was the city where I was born, where my wife was born, where we were both raised, and in fact, where I got to spend most of my career, the first 18 years of my academic career, in fact, and where my 4 children were all born and were raised. And I would probably still be there and not living on the frozen tundra if it had not been for an event that occurred in 2005, which changed my life significantly, but also brought me to the intersection of faith and science, although in a way that was rather unusual, not as a chosen area really, but almost in a sense out of desperation, and I'll explain that. In fact, let's see, will that go? There it is. Now this is me in August of 2005, and that, anybody know what that big storm is there? That's Hurricane Katrina, very good. So in July of 2005, after several wonderful years on the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain, can't really see the lake because the hurricane is covering it, my wife and I decided to move closer to New Orleans to reduce my 90-minute commute over the world's longest bridge, over water, 24 miles, the Causeway Bridge, New Orleans, through the central business district of the city, over the Mississippi River, and deep into the West Bank neighborhood called Algiers. So that was what I did, back and forth each day, where I was chair of the Department of Theology at Our Lady of Holy Cross College in Algiers. We moved in early July of 2005, and 5 weeks later, Katrina flooded our newly purchased home in Metairie, Louisiana, which is a suburb of New Orleans. It was only 9 inches of water, but when most of your belongings are still in boxes on the floor, 9 inches is enough to wipe out a lot of stuff. So we ended up as refugees for a month. We stayed actually in a vacant room at a parish rectory in a little town you probably never visited called Bunkie, Louisiana. My son's godfather was a priest in Bunkie, and so he took us in. So we stayed in a vacant room in his rectory. We were actually out of our home for 9 more months. Now, you probably don't remember this. Some of you, many of you are probably not even old enough to remember it. But in the months before Katrina raced across the Gulf of Mexico and crashed into our community, there was a widely televised public debate going on that was kind of all, was a big controversy that was affecting everyone in the United States. It had to do with a court case in Dover, Pennsylvania, about evolution, intelligent design theory, and the public school curriculum. And so even President Bush at the time kind of weighed in on the issue. I was interested. I would hear it on the news and on the radio. But at the time, I had a new job as a department chair of an undergraduate theology program, a happy, busy family life with a wife and 2 young children. My oldest, Margaret, was 5. My second, John, was 3. And then selling our first home and buying a second, I didn't have much time to pay very much attention to that at all. But on August 29th of 2005, Hurricane Katrina saw to it that I actually had nothing but time. The flooding of New Orleans shut down the fall 2005 semester at the college where I was teaching just as it began. As I said, our own house flooded. And as we sat around Bunkie, I had nothing to do but watch the news and fret as the water poured in and just kept rising. And it was literally the week after Hurricane Katrina hit that I received a phone call from a priest I had never heard of before, a priest by the name of Father Bryce Shields, who was a priest of the Archdiocese of Mobile, Alabama, and the president of McGill Catholic High School. And he proposed to me an interesting possibility, the development of a secondary religion course on faith and science for his school. So faced with the rumors that the college where I taught might close its doors, I didn't hesitate to accept. So pretty much the word among the faculty was that we might get paid in September. But because of the devastation of about the area where about 40% of our students lived, the word was on the street that we probably wouldn't actually get paid much more after that, and the college would shut down. So here I was saying yes to a project for which I had no specific training, no direct training. I had taken a course in faith and science before. I had never really done a lot of reading in it. For the first few months, I didn't even have an open library to rely on because everything was closed, right? But also, even though I had said yes to it, I had a great deal of insecurity because I wasn't sure. I had the uneasy feeling that even if I had had access to like the best library in the world at my disposal, I feared I discovered that the claims of conflict between faith and science that I had heard over and over would prove to be true. I was worried, had never really thought seriously about it, that actually the Catholic faith and modern science could not be reconciled with one another. That actually was the kind of thing where you had to choose one or the other. Now, out of necessity is the mother of invention, right? I set my doubts aside, and once we found a reliable internet connection, I began purchasing and reading every science or religion book I could afford. And as it happens, the first book that I read was a book that's pictured here on the left, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith by the American particle physicist, Dr. Stephen Barr. I still consider it providential that the very first book I read on science and religion was one of the very best, not only that I read then, but that I've ever read since. Barr's book, along with our recently deceased Pope Benedict XVI's masterpiece, In the Beginning, on the biblical creation accounts, became the standards by which I measured the rest of my research and later on my own writing. Now, shortly after that, I received another providential moment. I was on the phone with a priest, Father James Sosias, who was editor-in-chief of Midwest Theological Forum, a religion textbook publisher, talking about the possibility of publishing this curriculum that I was going to write. And he asked me if I had ever read any of John Paul II's papal addresses on science and faith. I had not, and so he offered me a collection that he had compiled. It was in a zip drive that he sent me a link to by email or something like that. Now, I was interested and hopeful. At this point, Pope John Paul II had just died. I mean, really, this is maybe September or October of 2005. He had passed away in late April of 2005. So I eagerly accepted his offer of this collection. I was hopeful that there might be a dozen addresses about faith and science over the 26 years of his papacy. And you can imagine my surprise when he sent me a zip drive that contained 143 addresses by St. John Paul II, dealing specifically with faith and science issues. As I scrolled through them, it was amazing to me. Here was an address to nuclear physicists. Here was one to biologists. They had doctors, university professors, university students. One of the very first ones, in fact, it may even be the very earliest one from 1979, was an address he gave to mark the 100th birthday of Albert Einstein, which I was like, wow, right? A good number of these addresses had been given to something called the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences. I remember reading that in the heading and thinking to myself, the Pope has a scientific academy? Well, like, when did that happen? I've never heard about this, right? And then also, and I'll talk about it, I'll actually be quoting it later. One of the most amazing things I found in there was a letter that he had written to the director of the Vatican Observatory. I was like, the Vatican has like a telescope? Like, I had no idea about any of those things. As for the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences, I had this picture in my mind of maybe a little office with some file cabinets and, some old tottering functionary like taking care of it, and that's it, right? Like a broom closet in the Vatican. I had no idea until much later that the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences is one of the most beautiful buildings in the Vatican Gardens. It's called the the Casino Pio IV, or Pius IV. I actually got to go there in 2018, which was pretty amazing. But so I decided that I would set aside all the other things I was reading and researching, and I would just go through these addresses one by one. From the first one, November 10th of 1979, when he called, the Pope did, for a re-examination of the Galileo affair, and actually identified Galileo as someone that had been mistreated by church authorities. Then the very last, November 8th, 2004, 5 months before his death, in less than a year from when I was reading these addresses. And this last one had all the feel of a loving farewell address to scientists. This is the conclusion of it. I wanted to share this with you before we went forward. He says, despite the uncertainties and the labor which every attempt to interpret reality entails, not only in the sciences, but also in philosophy and theology, the paths of discovery are always paths towards truth. And every seeker after truth, whether they are aware of it or not, is following a path which ultimately leads to God, who is truth itself. May your patient and humble dialogue with the world of science, of nature rather, bear fruit in ever new discoveries and an irreverent appreciation of its untold marvels. I share this one because every address that I read was saturated with this kind of respect for the scientific endeavor, for modern science, with excitement about the capacity of modern science not only to show us the truth, but also to open itself to an expansive approach to reason and an integrated view of reality, and even to enrich our understanding of the faith, to animate our worship of God with awe and wonder. And as I made my way through page after page, remember I told you I had that insecurity at the beginning? I began to feel that fade away and be replaced with excitement and hope. Now, I'm going to share in this talk, the main part of this talk will be sharing 5 quotes that I discovered in that reading that I hope will help you kind of think about the relationship between the Catholic faith and modern science. Some principles that John Paul II enunciated there. Now, there were things going on in our culture that in 2005, I wasn't really aware of, but actually, as I would continue to write, would become more and more aware of as I went along. So I began writing in October of 2005, this curriculum, which would become the first edition of the textbook that I published. I completed the draft in May of 2007. At exactly the same time, the writings of the so-called new atheists were popping up on bestseller lists. So Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, was published in 2005. In 2006, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, was published. In 2007, Christopher Hitchens produced God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, right? And so on. In fact, the message of these books could be well summarized by the title of a 4th book, Victor Stenger's God, the Failed Hypothesis, How Science Has Proven That God Does Not Exist. Okay? The interesting thing is that a monsoon of propaganda about science and religion being entirely contrary to one another, entirely inimical, and ultimately the idea that science requires that a person simply reject belief in God, or much less belief in the Catholic faith, was coming at the very same time. And this had a massive impact, it turned out, on young Catholics. In a 2016 study released by the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, which is a Georgetown center for researching the church and Catholics, you have a number of that. The so-called warfare between science and faith is considered to be one of the number one reasons why many of those who were interviewed say they no longer practice their faith. And another study by a University of Notre Dame sociologist, Christian Smith, 78% of those who no longer practice their faith cited the, quote, inherent warfare of science and religion as the reason why they didn't practice it. But they no longer practice their faith, right? So I didn't realize at the time, but this was a significant moment actually to be writing about this very topic, as I would find out again and again. One of the reasons why so many young people disaffiliate from the church in the name of science, right, has to do, I think, with something that John Paul II himself foreseen when he wrote his letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory in 1988. He said, Christians will inevitably assimilate the prevailing ideas about the world, and today these are deeply shaped by science. The only question is whether they will do so critically or unreflectively, with a depth and nuance or with a shallowness that debases the gospel and leaves us ashamed before history. It seems that, unfortunately, at least in the United States, many, many Catholics, many of those who are responsible for forming the faith of others, never actually thought about the scientific literacy of the young people that they were teaching, okay? And didn't then answer some of the key questions about how the faith relates to all of the things that science has shown us about the world. That was simply left behind. Okay. So, as I said, what I want to do in my presentation tonight is look at 5 quotes that I discovered in reading John Paul II's addresses and offer a little commentary on them to give you an idea of the real relationship between the Catholic faith and modern science, embodied in the things that he says, right? So I'll start with one of the most powerful ones. It's actually included in an address that he gave to a colloquium on science, philosophy, and theology in 1986, September of 1986. And the Pope said, the theological teaching of the Bible in the church does not seek to teach us the how of things, but rather the why of things. You might notice that's where I got my title for my talk today, right? The how of things, not the how of things, but rather the why of things. So late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once put it, science takes things apart to show us how they work. Religion brings things together to show us what they mean. So consider this question. How did you get to this seminar today? Did you walk? Did you drive? Right? Whatever it might be, right? Each of us had a mode of transportation. I walked over from the USC hotel, right? Ultimately, yesterday I got on a plane in South Bend and flew here. Why did you come to the seminar today? That's a very different question, isn't it? Couldn't you answer that question without reference to how you got here? But you could still give us an insightful answer, right? So, how did the universe come to be? Maybe give me the short version. Boom, the Big Bang, right? Very good, yeah. Why does the universe exist? That's a very different question, isn't it? It's also a very interesting question. To help you understand the distinction, join me in this thought experiment. So imagine being with me at one of my favorite festivals in New Orleans, the Jazz and Heritage Festival, right? On a sunny afternoon, probably very hot because it's in late April, but you manage. And while we're watching the show, we notice, you notice, that an alien spacecraft has landed in a field near the festival. You actually see it come down, and you notice someone getting out and coming over while you're watching this incredible set. It could be jazz, blues, zydeco, whatever it might be. Just, go with it, right? They come up, and you notice them observing the stage. You watch them observing the band. You watch them observing the people there, right? And then they notice that you've noticed them, so they walk up to you. And this alien, who strangely can understand and speak English, because they always can, right? In the movies, they always can do that, approaches you and asks you about the noise that's been coming from the stage. So you begin by explaining what kind of music was being played. As I said, blues, folk, rock and roll, whatever it might be. And you go through the type of music it is, the instruments it involves, Because you actually did some, or actually had some training in music, you go a little bit further. You tell them a little music theory about harmony, keys, and octaves. And once you've said enough for the alien to understand, she responds, well, now I understand how the music is played, but I don't understand why everyone here is so excited about it. Right? And at that moment, you realize that the alien still has no idea about why music is composed and performed and what meaning it has for the band, for you, for the other people who are there listening. So now you have an entirely different task of explanation. Ultimately, you might say that people love music because it moves them by putting the experience of being human into beautiful sound, right? That's a great answer, and I think a very valid answer to why music is played. Music is about experiencing your ordinary life from a new perspective. Or you might say that it unites the fans and the band in a common experience. So music creates kind of a relationship, a community, right? Or you might say that through the poetry and the musical artistry, you're drawn out of your ordinary life and your own experiences for a moment, that music is about transcendence. Notice that in order to explain the music festival, you have two choices. In order to explain the music that's being seen, you can explain the internal logic of the music, describing how it's composed and played, right? But in order to explain the meaning of music to those who play it or enjoy it, you have to go beyond how it's played and answer why questions about it. That fanciful story, I think, offers an imperfect but helpful way of thinking about the relationship between science and faith. Science approaches the physical universe according to its internal rules and patterns. It tells us how it works, like your first explanation of music. Faith approaches the universe according to what the whole system of the universe means, why it exists, its role in human happiness, questions about its creator and his intentions for it, just like your second explanation of music. So why questions and how questions about the universe, just as they are about music, are very different. But taken together, they can provide a fuller picture, a deeper understanding of reality. Now, this means that faith and science are dealing with reality from two different perspectives that are not in competition with each other. So they can never really be in conflict. Vatican II already had acknowledged this before John Paul II. At the Second Vatican Council, in one of the documents called Gaudium et Spes, the council fathers, the bishops assembled at the council, said, methodical research, provided it is carried out in a truly scientific manner and does not override moral laws, can never conflict with the faith. Because the things of the world and the things of faith derive from the same God. The great opening words of John Paul II's papacy were, be not afraid, open wide the doors to Christ, right? Now, this first quote that I've shown you, he's saying, Christians, don't be afraid of science, right? It has a great deal of truth to provide for us, provided we understand that it does so from one perspective and not a perspective that's in competition with the perspective of faith. All right, I want to bring you on to a second quote here. And in the second quote, actually, we kind of can apply this how-why distinction to the Bible, right? This one, I think, really captured my attention because it seems to me that for most people, it's precisely the difference between, say, the biblical accounts of creation and modern scientific cosmology and evolutionary biology that really make them think that the two things are in conflict with one another. I do a lot of work with Catholic high school science and religion teachers, with a big grant from the Templeton Foundation to help them integrate faith and science. And again, they come to us, especially the science teachers, and say, well, the religion teachers too, and say, already in middle school, they learn about the Big Bang, and then they come and say, that means the Bible is false, right? Okay. This is from a 1981 speech that John Paul II gave at the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences, which I mentioned earlier. And he says, when the Bible speaks to us of the origin of the universe and its makeup, it The Bible itself, rather, speaks to us of the origin of the universe and its makeup, not in order to provide us with a scientific treatise, but in order to state the correct relationships of man with God and the universe. Any other teaching about the origin and makeup of the universe is alien to the intentions of the Bible, which does not wish to teach us how heaven was made, but how one goes to heaven. See how he's using that word how there again? Right? The Bible is about teaching us the deepest answers to the why questions about the universe, not how the universe was made. Of course, we have beautiful accounts of creation in Scripture that teach us deep truths about the nature of the universe, the nature of humanity. But are they really about teaching us how the universe was created? Well, John Paul II is saying here we're looking for the wrong kind of details, or the wrong kind of information if we're looking at the Bible for that, right? The biblical accounts of creation don't tell us how the universe was made. They tell us in symbolism and poetic language the deepest meaning of the universe. The truth of the Bible on creation is not the kind of truth a cosmologist would write on a timeline or a graph. Its truth is the kind of truth we need to write on our hearts, right? Now, much more can be said about this. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Grapevine, Texas, Bishop Barron's Word on Fire conference, giving a talk on science and the Bible, right? I don't want to spend too much time on this topic because I want to introduce you to a few others. But when we think about the Bible's creation accounts, I think a nice way to think about them is to remember, or to think about them in terms of a literary genre, right? Which we could call a symbolic cosmogony or cosmogony, a symbolic account of the beginning and development of the universe. An account that uses symbolism to show its deepest truth, the meaning of the universe and of our place within it. Right? The Big Bang Theory is a scientific cosmogony that involves careful calculations to give us exact details about time, space, matter, and energy. Right? The Bible's not about giving us those details. It's primarily an inspired work, divinely inspired work of imagination that captures a truth deeper than other modes of human writing can convey. So far, the quotes I've shared focus on the difference between faith and science, right? The Bible isn't about science. Science tells us how, the Bible tells us why, so on. They show that faith and science are not in conflict, but they don't show what one can do for the other. In this third quote I want to share with you from 1982, which the Pope offered at a symposium with nuclear physicists, he engaged another theme that he would revisit over and over, that the findings of science can enrich and strengthen our faith. He said this, contemporary science, your own, he said to these nuclear physicists, allows us to discover a world that is far more wonderful than ever known, and brings us back even more strongly to the Creator, to his wisdom, to his power, and to his mystery. Now that brings us to a question, one that I had right away when I read this quote. In what way does science bring us back to the Creator? Remember, I was writing a curriculum for high school. If there's a way that science brings us back to the Creator, I certainly wanted to include it in what I was developing here. Well, let's first recognize what this quote is not saying. It's not saying that science can prove the existence of God for us by its method. Science begins with the physical universe and it ends with the physical universe. Is God a part of the universe? No, God is the creator of the universe, right? So God's existence cannot be demonstrated by physics, by chemistry, by biology, etc. Actually, this is an additional quote. I'm not including this in my 5. John Paul II made this point in 1985 when he said this. He said, in speaking of the existence of God, we should underline that we are not speaking of proofs in the sense implied by the experimental sciences. Scientific proofs in the modern sense of the word are valid only for things perceptible to the senses. Since it is only on such things that scientific instruments of investigation can be used. To desire a scientific proof of God would be equivalent to lowering God to the level of the beings of our world. And we would therefore be mistaken methodologically in regard to what God is. Science must recognize its limits and inability to reach the existence of God. It can neither affirm nor deny God's existence. Now, we shouldn't count this against God's existence, right? Science can't do this because of what science is. That's the real methodological restriction. Science deals with the physical world and how it works. So let's go back to the quote. How then can science bring us back even more strongly to God? Well, if you read what John Paul II is saying here in the context of other things he said, he means that science can give us new ways to see, imperfectly but powerfully, the beauty of God, our Creator. Faith is a gift, a grace given by God. And science can help us not by giving us faith, by kind of demonstrating the existence of God scientifically, which it cannot do, right? But by helping us see more clearly the God in whom we believe so that we can praise and love God. This is not a new idea. We find it in the very last book of the Old Testament to be written, the book of Wisdom, in chapter 13. This book was written about 50 to 100 years before the birth of Jesus. And the author says, foolish by nature were all who were in ignorance of God, and who from the good things that we see did not succeed in knowing the one who is, and from studying the artworks, that is the natural world and its beauty, did not recognize the artist. He's talking about pagan worshipers of nature and natural forces here. He says, instead, they assume that fire or wind or the swift air or the circuit of the stars or the mighty water or the luminaries of heaven, the governors of the world, were gods. Now, if out of joy in the beauty of these, they thought they were gods, let them know how far more excellent is the Lord than these. For the Lord, the original source of beauty, fashioned them. Or if they were struck by their might and energy, let them realize from these things how much more powerful is the one who made them. For from the greatness and the beauty of created things, their original author, by analogy, is seen. What is the beauty, or what is meant here by the beauty of created things? The ancients, when they talked about beauty as the proper relationship between the parts of something and the whole. Beauty is the splendor we discover when we see order and harmony in things. So, think of a beautiful face or a beautiful piece of music, and you get the idea. The Book of Wisdom says we see that kind of harmony in nature, and that harmony brings us joy, right? God is seen in the beauty and greatness of created things. And the joy that the beauty of the world gives us is evidence, not proof, but evidence that our faith in God is true. We need not look to use some scientific data or theory to say, aha, there really is a God because of this equation, right? So rather than asking the question, does science verify or demonstrate the truth of God's existence? We should ask, what picture does science give us of greatness and beauty in our world? Because it's in that greatness and beauty that we see a reflection of God, the Creator, the divine author who causes them all. And it's here where 20th century physics comes in. It turns out that in discovering the laws of physics, scientists did not explain away the beauty and order that was visible in nature, as sometimes is assumed. Sometimes people look and they say, well, yeah, we see all these things and we think, oh, wow, that comes from God. But now we know about the forces, we know about subatomic particles, we know about the structure and the laws of the universe and how the universe works. And so we don't have to talk about God anymore. It turns out that the laws of nature are even more beautiful than the beautiful things they make possible. One of my favorite examples is the Dirac Equation, one of the greatest discoveries of all of modern physics. The physicist Paul Dirac was seeking an equation to describe how electrons behave. Now, you might imagine him working with a particle accelerator and doing minute measurements, but that technology didn't exist in 1928. So Dirac started formulating equations with this guiding principle, that they be beautiful. One day he found one that seemed extraordinarily beautiful, so he knew it must be important. Well, the pretty equation, as he liked to refer to it, turned out to describe the movement of many atomic and subatomic particles, electrons, protons, baryons, quarks. It even predicted the existence of antimatter, which no one had any idea existed before. Everything Dirac predicted with his equation would be confirmed later through the experiments of other scientists. Now, some people might argue that the beauty referred to by Dirac is purely a subjective judgment, one based on personal taste. You know, like some people who cook, nobody else likes their food, but they think it tastes good because they made it, right? Get that idea? But there's a powerful argument against that. Dirac did not see the beauty after he discovered the equation. It was the beauty of the equation that led him to recognize its importance. Later on, he said it is better to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit one's experiments. It's extraordinary if you think about that. Or consider the discovery of the Omegaminus particle, a subatomic particle that was discovered in 1964. 3 years before that, in 1961, the physicist Murray Gell-Mann was able to accurately predict its existence by based upon the incomplete pattern created by already discovered particles, a pattern that it would complete. So the particle pattern formed an inverse pyramid without a point, an inverse triangle without a point, right? So you see that bottom one there? And Gell-Mann, just from that, realized something must be missing. So he not only predicted its existence, that there would be a particle that completed the pattern, but all of its major characteristics simply by relying on a sense of what would be needed to exist to complete the beauty of what was already known. Or consider the E8 Lie group. This was discovered as a concept in algebra in 1888 by a mathematician named Wilhelm Killing. He developed it long before its necessity in describing the gauge symmetries of the fundamental forces of the universe were discovered. So for him, it was just an elegant piece of mathematics. But in developing it, he actually gave scientists something that they would later see was applicable to the material world. That's happened many times. Again and again through modern history, mathematicians have come up with mathematical ideas and developed branches of mathematics purely for the sake of their mathematical beauty, without ever dreaming that they had any relevance to the physical world, only to have it discovered later, oftentimes after they were dead, that these parts of mathematics were needed to express the fundamental laws of nature. These and many other examples reveal that the beauty found in the laws of nature, the artistic perfection of their design, is so perfect that it seems to be accessible primarily through mathematical creativity and not primarily through doing experiments. Now hold that idea in your mind for a moment, and I want you to consider 3 quotes that I'm going to put up here, not from John Paul II. One of them from St. Paul, the first one, from Scripture. St. Paul says of Christ in his letters to the Colossians, "For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Here we see a witness to the idea of Jesus, the divine Son of God, as the reason through whom the universe is created. He is the ultimate reason why we find an intelligible, structured universe. Indeed, it's kind of striking that St. Paul says, "In him all things hold together." That's an amazing quote, considering that so much beauty and symmetry is found precisely in the branch of physics which describes the fundamental forces of nature that physically hold all things together. Or Venerable Louis of Granada. He said in the 16th century, "What is God? The mind and reason of the universe. What is God? Everything that we see, because in all things we see his wisdom and assistance. And so we confess his greatness, which is so great that we cannot think of anything greater. And the third one actually comes from a non-believer, Nobel Prize winning physiologist George Wald, who is reflecting here on the picture that contemporary physics provides of beauty and symmetry in the laws of the universe. Listen to how what he says here rhymes with what Louis of Grenada said and what St. Paul said. Mind, he says, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth of the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source, and condition of physical reality. That the stuff of which physical reality is composed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe that breeds life, and so eventually evolves creatures that know and create. Science, art, and technology making animals. Wald's conclusion from reason is affirmed by faith, which provides not only the suggestion of a mind, but reveals the personal identity of that mind, right? The Son through whom the universe was made, who became flesh in Jesus Christ. Right? This is what St. John Paul II meant when he told particle nuclear physicists, your science can bring us back even more strongly to the Creator. Not that it can prove to us that God exists in some straightforward way, but because of the beauty it shows us in the world. Okay, quote number 4. I'm getting close to the end here. You guys are getting tired. You're starting to digest that food there. Should maybe get up and maybe do some calisthenics. When I started, actually for me, it's 3 hours ahead. So whatever time it is now is way past my bedtime. When I started my research in 2005, as I mentioned, a specific faith science controversy. Yeah, please, y'all want some more food? Stop it. A specific faith science controversy was playing out in the United States in a federal courtroom in Pennsylvania. It was called the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District case. The school board had decided to require that an alternative to evolution, which its proponents called intelligent design theory, be presented to all 9th grade biology students. Now, of course, I was writing a textbook on faith and science, which raised the question in my mind, how would you deal with this in a Catholic school? Should you teach evolution in a Catholic school? Should you try to come up with something that's suggestive of a creator? Now, before the case was ever concluded, I encountered this 1986 quote from John Paul II. It's pretty straightforward. There are no conflicts between Catholic doctrine and the scientific theory of evolution. Now, I already knew that 10 years later, John Paul II had made a rather famous statement that evolution was more than a hypothesis. But what struck me was how strong his statement is here. No means no. He didn't say there are a few conflicts between the Catholic faith and evolution, or that he wasn't aware of any conflicts between the Catholic faith and evolution. He said that there are no conflicts between evolution and the teaching of the church. Now, let's go back to the how-why distinction, and this becomes less surprising. From the Catholic perspective, when we say God created the world, what we mean is creation is the foundational, eternal, perfect act of love by which God causes all things to be. That answers why all living things exist. Biological evolution, the process studied by science, in which the rich, mind-blowing diversity of living things come to thrive on our planet. Does that answer how or why? Anybody remember? How, right, how? God causes all things to be, and out of love, gives them the ability to be causes of each other. God not only creates the universe, he makes it capable of doing what he desired it to do, to produce all kinds of incredible life forms, plants, animals, microorganisms. Above all, creatures capable of being in communion with him, creatures that are made in his image and likeness, human beings. Okay, each of these quotes, along with many others, were, to me, at this early stage in which I was writing, like epiphanies, moments of illumination. They erased my lingering concern that there really must be, or might be at least, some conflict between science and faith. But the final quote, I think, is the most exciting of all of them. because it shows not only that faith and science are not in conflict, as we saw in the first couple of quotes, and then also the fourth quote, not only that faith and science might have something to contribute to each other, but that they absolutely do have that. And even faith can be enriched by science. It was in his letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory, and here it is. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. Since that time in which I took on a faith and science project because I was a hurricane refugee, to now where I'm directing a major initiative at the University of Notre Dame based on faith and science, right? That quote has always remained to me the most inspiring and the most motivating. Because it tells me not just that my responsibility would be to show people that, yeah, you can do the science over here, and yeah, you can do the religion over there, and there's no problem with either. But rather that they have something to offer to each other. That they can, together, give us a fuller picture of reality in which the how and the why are united. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, so thank you all very much. All right. Now, I do have something to share, but I also have a respondent. If we get to it, I have to share later, great. If not, that's fine.
How about we get Roberto first?
Yes.
And David, Professor Albertson's going to say a couple words about Roberto. No?
Without any emphasis.
I'm just going to
Very briefly,
my colleague Roberto Del Oro
Yes,
from
yes.
Loyola Marymount University, who also directs the Bioethics Institute there. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Cardinal
I'm
Martinez.
going to sit down, drinking particular water.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. I truly enjoyed it. And I had the opportunity to have the text in advance, so I think I pondered what Chris was saying quite deeply. And there's much in the text that is really worth reflecting about. I don't disagree with anything that he said. Everything that he said is absolutely commendable, and in fact, very much to the point of the fundamental truth that science and faith are not in disagreement with one another. At the same time, I ask myself the question, why is it that the majority of scientists are not believers? I'm not just saying Catholic, but they're not believers. Why is it that science seems to almost spontaneously take scientists away from belief in God? And in trying to respond to this question, I wonder whether a kind of more critical take on the genealogy of modern science might not be necessary. And that doesn't necessarily contradict the fundamental statement Chris made, following, of course, John Paul II, that there is absolute harmony between faith and science. But the fact is that faith never encounters science in itself. Faith encounters particular theoretical articulations of science. And therefore, it's the particular theoretical articulation of science that emerges in modernity, that pushes progressively the question of the relation between science and faith in the direction of a dialectical, in fact, alternative relation. So that also means that while pleading for the harmony, we also need to exercise a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, if you want to use a sort of difficult term, toward a certain posture of science there is a posture of science that is in fact irreconcilable with faith. But in fact, it is irreconcilable with a relation to reality that is defined not just by an attitude of control, by an attitude of manipulation, but in fact by an attitude of reverence. So my three brief points are essentially the following. We have to recognize that the posture of the scientific mind at the beginning of modernity is very particular. And that is a posture of complete neutralization, of complete objectification of reality. Not only that, it is a posture of control over reality, a willingness to, in fact, submit reality to the power of human beings. As much as we can admire Galileo Galilei, who, by the way, is Italian as I am, but one reads the Il Saggiatore, the Essayer, and one encounters very puzzling statements about his own relation to nature. Nature needs to be raped in order for the secret of nature to yield itself to the hypothesis of the scientist. Of course, the scientific hypothesis put forth by, and theory put forth by Galileo turned out to be correct. But the posture of the mind with which that particular type of scientific theory rests, or on which it rests, progressively leads science in the direction of a lack of respect, or in fact a manipulation of nature that turns into a complete objectification of its reality, right? The distinction between primary quality and secondary qualities. A reality is really not defined by what Galileo, and before him with him Descartes, will define the secondary qualities. Everything that has to do with the senses, therefore the perception of beauty of reality, of which Chris eloquently spoke, that has to be taken out of reality, because reality can simply be reduced to the equation of mass, velocity, etc., etc. Those are the primary quality of reality. And Newton essentially will articulate a notion of reality that is defined by this kind of neutral there-ness. Now, if reality is reduced thus, then everything that is on the part of the subject, on the part of the human being, is inevitably, shall we say, non-objectifiable. It is inevitably irrational. That is not only the faith that becomes irrational, but aesthetic judgment becomes irrational. To an extent, even moral values become irrational, or become a function of a purely subjective judgment. So, in this kind of objectivistic, neutral reduction of reality, there can be no traces of God anymore. And then the question becomes, can science give us back a more complex understanding of reality, in which those traces can be found again? Thus, it seems to me, and I'm sorry, I don't want to make it too long, but it's also instructive not simply to get at a kind of statement on the harmony of science and faith from a faith perspective, but also to look at the critical analysis of modern science by philosophy. All the great philosophers of the 20th century, thinking about Heidegger, I'm thinking about Husserl, the contemporary French philosopher Michel Henry, has said very clearly that the problem of science is the fact that science cannot address any longer questions of meaning. Thus, you get the new atheists. Thus, you get Catholic students who abandon the faith because ultimately they buy not just into science, but into a positivistic understanding of science. That positivistic understanding cannot be harmonized with faith, but it cannot be harmonized with any search for meaning. Therefore, to an extent, it can't harmonize with philosophy either. It can be harmonized with aesthetics. It can be harmonized with morality. So my final point then is, under what condition can then the harmony of faith and science be regained? On the premise that, of course, truth is one, and the access to truth on the part of the human mind, when honest and open, does not pit the scientist against the person of faith. But there is, in a way, a condition that I think is essential for the person of faith and the person of science to actually gain this sense of harmony. And to me, that is the retrieval of a sense of fundamental reverence toward reality. Reverence is the source, not just of faith. Reverence is the source of philosophy. Reverence is the source of science as well. And in fact, the best scientists, beginning with Einstein, but of course we can go back, say, to the beginning of modernity. We think about a philosopher like Spinoza, have asked the question: we operate on the basis of the premise that reality is intelligible, and that in fact our own mind encounters reality as it searches for its truth. But we cannot explain that harmony. We cannot explain that conditional possibility that is given to us, that in a way is the gift we as scientists work on, and toward which we can only have an attitude of recognition and reverence with which we can pursue our own research. So obviously my observations do not reject anything of what Chris has said. It seems to me that when you think about a certain type of scientism, which is in fact the prevalent ideological rendition of science, and here we have to think also of the connection between science and technology. Right? I mean, modern science is defined by the technological paradigm. Then the attitude of manipulation, of reduction, of control becomes, in a way, the killer of faith. But it is the killer of faith because it is ultimately the killer of reverence. It is the killer of any kind of search for meaning that ultimately makes us live as human beings. Right? The mathematician cannot, or the physicist cannot explain his or her passion for physics and mathematics in purely mathematical terms. That's exactly what I think we should be thinking about when we think about the question of harmony of faith and science. And yeah, sorry if I went on and on and on, but thank you again for thank you very much.
You're not going to stay up so we can ask you a question.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm also available. I'm also available.
Chris is the one you should
Or
ask
should we go
questions.
back to Chris and back to Rebecca?
Both of us.
Yeah, I'll come up here.
Oh,
By the way, I agree with everything though.
Of course, of course.
By the way, should we take, do you guys want some more food?
What's your name?
Can you say your name?
Yeah, I'm Nick.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you think, as Roberto was explaining, kind of the transition from during the scientific revolution, the vast majority of scientists that were pioneering were Christian and
Right.
not believers in God. And then talking about kind of that flip that we've seen of not deriving the meaning and the pursuit of science in the name of God, but rather in the name of kind of control and manipulation, as he was talking about, lack of reverence. Where do you think that switch kind of happened, and what do you think caused that to kind of flip it on its head, that the best scientists in the world were those that were believers in God, and then we have this weird fade into kind of an opposite direction, not quite as extreme, but what do you think that comes from?
Well, I think that, first of all, the idea of creation requiring reverence, right, is very closely related to this idea that we saw in the Book of Wisdom, that we see God, right, reflected by analogy in the beauty of things, right? So there's this kind of analogy of being where which each and everything in so far as it exists, right, reflects and radiates God, who is his creator. Obviously, the loss of that sense is a big part of what leads to a point where people can then begin to approach nature as to the subject of something to be dominated, controlled, and manipulated. There's a wonderful book, one of the best that I've read, not an easy book, but worthwhile, called Theology and the Scientific Imagination by, he was actually a professor at Princeton, but he died rather young, Jewish professor of Jewish studies by the name of Amos Funkenstein. I tell my students whenever I talk about Funkenstein that he has the best name. And if I could, if my wife would let me, I'd change my name so I could be Professor Funkenstein. But anyway, Theology and the Scientific Imagination, he talks about precisely this kind of this switch over or transition to a way of thinking about the world in which God's relationship to it is no longer apparent, right? Because of certain assumptions that arise, and then that kind of brings us off in the wrong direction. So we might say that in a sense, one of the ways back for a Catholic would be to recognize that it's precisely through natural things that God saves us, right? I mean, water, bread, wine, oil, these things, the sacraments, right, show how these things can be symbolic of supernatural realities, of salvation, of communion with God, right? Should be something to remind us that it's not just true of those things, right? It's true in a very special way of those things, but it's also true, therefore, of all material things, right? If the world was simply something neutral, right, something to be set aside, God would never have assumed matter and become flesh in the womb of the Virgin, right? Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
If I may add a few things, the recently the late Pope Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, wrote wonderful things about this. But I think his point is especially important for us, and that is that the question of the relation between science and theology, science and faith, let's say science and faith, cannot be had without some kind of mediation of a certain type of philosophical structure.
Right.
And that means a certain type of concept of reason and rationality. And that is because ultimately the analogy of faith and reason makes you understand how is it that a certain concept of rationality then leads you away from a certain type of relation to the world, or leads you to the type of relation to the world that might be supportive of a faith perspective. So I believe that the key to the question, or the answer to your question, has to do with the particular notion of rationality that in modernity, let's say, with Galileo, with Descartes, sets in. And that is a notion of rationality that is defined by a fundamental dualism, right? It's not reason in nature or reason in creation, but it's reason against nature. It's reason against creation. And by the way, this type of dualism, whose consequences, of course, we have experienced with the environmental crisis, it's also a dualism within the human being itself. It's mind versus body.
Right.
It's soul, okay, it's a concept that progressively disappears. But it's the problem of a cascade of dualisms that sets in, that ultimately leads us to say that, of course, also the dualism of faith and reason must be unreconcilable, unbridgeable. Right.
Can I say a word about that? One of my favorite systematic theologians is Jean-Yves Lacoste, and he takes, he's a French philosopher, polymath. Jean-Yves Lacoste references John Paul II, who thought faith and science are twin wings by which man soars to the truth. I don't know where John Paul II said that, but it's a beautiful image.
Yeah. It's a cyclical, yeah.
And Lacoste says, hold on, because say when Newton is writing his Bible commentary, he was as committed to that as he was to any science. So faith and to even taxify faith and reason in the way we have, it's fine, words flown out and mighty subject. But in point of that, in spite of that, from an interview, right, how we feel, we don't always know the difference, right? Well, now I'm using faith, now I'm using reason. It's more holistic than that. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we can distinguish between them.
Right.
But, I mean, just think of theology. It's faith seeking understanding, right? So it's the application of our powers of reason to understanding what God has revealed, okay? But in a way that's reverent. Now, a lot of modern theology, I think, has lost that. In other words, think about, so you're talking about nature, for instance, as being the object or subject of manipulation, of control, et cetera, where we're going to wrest its secrets out of it violently.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, modern biblical exegesis can oftentimes be like that. The Bible is not approached in faith. The Bible is simply approached from what sources it comes from, et cetera. We're going to bring it all down to that, right? The interesting thing is that although the entire path is unfortunate, right? The methods that are produced actually become something that can serve faith later, right? So if you read the Second Vatican Council on Scripture, it talks about modern methods of analysis as being kind of like a first step in understanding it. But then we have to take it, you know what I mean, reading the Bible holistically as it points towards Christ, under the, you know what I mean, and so on, right? In light of the tradition, that kind of thing. So the fruits of these things do not themselves necessarily have to be diabolical, but I think the assumptions with which they're applied can be. And we need to be very careful of that, because it really is kind of the spirit of the modern age. Any other questions anybody have? That one?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
I'd like to know how many of you are scientists in this room, or engineers, or so does your faith, like, is it compartmentalized? Do you bring it into not necessarily like your papers and tests and stuff, but it does inform you as people doing science.
Yeah. So as an engineer, I find kind of, so what is your name?
Roberto.
Roberto. The idea that technology is, or the idea that modern science is pretty much expressed almost always through technology. It's how can we advance technology? How can we improve our technology? But it's never done with any idea of how is this going to help people, or should we even be doing this? Like I'll just use like the example of space. Like space is a cool and it's an exciting thing, and we want to have like a mastery over our natural world. But it's almost like, should we really be going out of our box? Like, what is up there? Like, oh yeah, it's not profitable right now, but once we start mining these moon rocks, we'll get some money. It's like, okay, so we're just going up there, we're spending money to make more money. I don't know.
Yeah. At the same time, though, would you also say that the techniques you're learning as an engineer can, with some creativity and dedication, be brought to the service of humanity or human
Certainly.
beings, right?
No, absolutely. I think, and I just think in terms of like dual medical technologies,
Right.
We have so many beautiful technologies that can enhance human life and assist us. But at the same time, there's also a lot of stuff that will, go against that and
Sure.
can be used with dangerous effects. But yeah, no, I certainly science and religion I've never seen a conflict between the two. But I just think it is largely secular, and I think it's done without a consideration of things like, beauty and reason and natural moral law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking when you were talking about technology, which in a way is the other face of science, right? We can't really talk about modern science without talking about technology. Then the question comes up, what exactly is the essence of technology? A question that, of course, is being posed philosophically, and that the scientists tend to avoid, right? Okay, in the best of all possible scenarios, we can say technology is something neutral. Therefore, we can use technology for the good, or we can use technology to do something bad. Right, so the atomic discovery of the atomic fission could perhaps be used to deliver different sources of energy, but in fact can turn into the atomic bomb. At the same time, this might be a kind of naive way of thinking about technology, because technology, as for example, the philosopher Heidegger has pointed out, becomes a kind of in-framing, that's his term, of which you become prisoner in the end. I'm sorry, if you've ever gone to a doctor here in the US, you will come to realize very quickly that technology is a wonderful thing, but in the end, the doctor is on the computer typing in and taking data, and after 10 minutes, you don't know whether he or she has actually talked to you at all.
Yeah.
Right? And in a way, the technology that's supposed to liberate a different, in fact, more human type of relationality imprisons that relationality into a framework that becomes an iron cage. And that's the problem. So again, I don't reject the idea of harmony of faith and science, etc., etc. But I do believe that there is also a kind of ideological unfolding of the trajectory of modern science. is extremely problematic. And in that sense, faith and the best of philosophy, because that's the point. It's not only the fact that we react to that as believers, we react to that as human beings, close, or if you want, closer to life, the reality of life, and ultimately the search for the meaning of life, which is what we are left with at the end of the day. You know, when you have put down your cell phone, you have to ask yourself, how is my conscience? Can I fall asleep peacefully? And those questions are trans-technical, trans-scientific, as Chris has pointed out.
Soren Kierkegaard used to say, science can tell us everything about everything except for what it means to be a human in the world who has to die, which is pretty much everything, right? At least from the human perspective, that whole question is an essential one. So, yeah.
In that sense, it doesn't help to be later in time, right?
One of the,
God says our ancestors are better than us in love, or you can't outstrip your ancestors that way.
Yeah, one of the things I think which should give us hope, and we should carry the virtue of hope, is that Christ came to redeem all things human, right? And that there is a path for the redemption of the scientific mindset, right? As long as some of the most important things which were said tonight by Roberto are kept in mind, right? And become a habit of being. In other words, virtuous science, the use of science and scientific methodology and scientific knowledge virtuously by human beings, which will always mean sacrifice, which will always be harder than not trying to pursue that, right? But it's worth the pursuit. Yeah. All right. Is that everything? Or
Yeah.
any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah. We could get Gary at 9, or we could end now.
We end now in case people need to leave, but I'm sure our chairs would be happy to stay if there's any questions after.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Thank you all very much for coming.
I want to say 2 last things. I want to plug the next event here with Frank Pasquale. He's a endowed professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. He's at the vanguard of artificial intelligence and law. And basically, he's arguing that you can't let AI leave the station without human expertise and, legal counsel. So please come to that. Second thing, please feed your roommates. Take what you want.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming. I hope that was great.
Yeah.
Should have been a successful one.
Yes.
Thanks. Good night. Good night. Thank you.
I'll be right back.
Oh, okay.
I'm not gonna spend money on it.
You're at Jefferson for the house.
Oh, nice. Very much.
Oh, it's gonna chill.
I'll go with you for 20 minutes.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if Dave recorded it, if there's a way to.
Yeah, I think he will. He live streamed it, but I don't know if that means he recorded it.
There's a couple things that
I wish, let me see if I
Mind if I
if I
like
do.
move some of it into here?
I'd be happy to send you the transcript for the talk.
Like the whole.
You just look at it yourself, yeah.
Okay, just like this, like I guess we'll cut out as we go ahead, but- All right, thank you.
Piece of paper?
I have, not a piece of paper, but I can write
Okay.
phone.
Yeah. It's,
Yeah, I know.
I'm gonna ask you for your W-9 so I can
Sure, great, so you said, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto, great point.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Let's see. No, that was a great response.
That was good.
Yeah.
I hope you liked the turnout.
Yeah, it was fine, absolutely.
Thank you.
There you go, man.
Quality,
You're all set.
quality, not
You're
quantity.
gonna eat for a week.
Yeah, this will keep me.
So I wanted to know, who's your favorite scientist?
Oh, goodness. Oh, a living?
No.
Oh.
It's like, I'll make it harder. Okay.
Despite his unfortunate remark in Il Saggiatore, I love Galileo. But Blessed Nicholas Steno is without a doubt my favorite. The Danish Lutheran convert to Catholicism, who was the first really, a famous anatomist in his day, and discovered, basically was the first one to correctly identify things like seashells and some on mountaintops as the remains, as fossils, basically.
Wow.
Yeah. And I wrote an article that talks about his life in the spring 2022 issue of Notre Dame Magazine, which is online. It's called Partners in Truth. So if you'll go Partners in Truth and my name, you can learn about him. But my email is just my first initial.